So this is the book, The Importance of Work in an Age of Uncertainty. And it's interesting that I wrote this before the pandemic hit. And the book got some attention, from my colleagues in the professional world. But somehow after the pandemic started, I was interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, Boston Globe, because people will see in the title when they did searches, reporters saw it, because people now speak about this age as an age of uncertainty. So, but I think it's actually quite interesting because I think that this book foreshadowed what has happened, but also functioned as a way of revealing what the world of work was actually like, and why it was so easy for it to why it crumbled so quickly was really detailed in this book. So let me talk a little. I'm going to, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about this project. I've mentioned why the book became so popular. I'll review the theoretical framework and the methods and process of it. I'll give a tour of the contents and talk about implications as well. So in my view, given in the research I've done and also in the counseling work I've done over the years, and I feel like the experience of work was becoming increasingly harsh and difficult and painful. I felt that the neoliberal turn that started, in my view, it started in the 70s and 1980s. In the United States, the turning point for us was the election of Ronald Reagan, which I think had a global impact actually in kind of raising the profile of these neoliberal ideas, which basically includes deregulating the work environment, deregulating labor markets, and operating under the assumption that a free market will benefit everyone. So I felt like that we needed to really discuss this, and I also felt like it was critical to do an in-depth qualitative research study of the nature of work in the United States. You will notice the book is only about the US, but as you will see as I go into this book, it would be impossible to do this book with multiple countries and have it not be like 1,000 pages. So it just focused on the US at this point. So why this project? The world is changing very radically. Even before the pandemic, we've seen the rise of precarious work, increases in the length and impact of long-term unemployment. I mentioned it's the same in Switzerland, but a deindustrialization, loss of manufacturing, and growing inequality, which is related to all of these other factors. So here's an example of what's been going on. This is again before the pandemic. People at Uber striking for basically to be treated, to have a decent work conditions. Another reason why I wrote this was I felt that I was concerned about the ill-informed solutions that were being advocated by politicians and government leaders and corporate leaders in relation to the problems about work and security and stability. I've also been concerned, I'm sure many of you are as well, that in discussions about work and labor issues, most of that comes from economists. Economists are kind of like the privileged social science in the world of public policy. And it's disturbing because I think economics is a great social science, but there are other ways of understanding people's work experiences. And the problem with economics is it looks at macro level factors and doesn't really elevate the concerns of individuals. In the United States, and I'm sure because the United States in some ways takes up so much space in the world, by that I mean psychological space, that we just take up a lot of space. I'm sure we take up a lot of your news airwaves. I think we have enough news now to keep people going if they're looking to watch news. But so to give you an example, the disparities in the workplace in the US are really striking. You could see here disparities based on people's social identities and their race and ethnicity. You can see disparities based on disability. United States, we have a very low participation of people with disabling conditions, very low labor market participation. These are the median incomes in the year 2016, which has not changed a lot in the last few years. You could see that one of the major problems in the US, of course, is our 400-year history of racism and white supremacy, which is manifested, as you can see here, with the lowest wages of any social group in our country, considerably lower. Also lower are the Hispanic and Latinx communities. Then we also have ongoing issues with gender and work. And I imagine you have similar data in Switzerland that would parallel this, that women earn less than men do for the same work. But in the US, and I don't know if it's the same in Switzerland, that women are actually more highly educated now than men are. They're more likely to finish high school, more likely to finish university, more likely to get graduate degrees. But yet we see here that one of the world's 1.3 billion poor, 70% of those folks are women. So the conceptual framework for this project is psychology of working theory, which we've gone over. And now you're all experts, I hope. So in about 5 or 6 years ago, my graduate students and I started a project that we call the Boston College Working Project. And it's based on interviews of 58 people in the United States that were selected initially based on people we knew who we thought would be able to provide us with interesting perspectives about work. It was what we call a purposive sample. The sample basically we tried to make the sample diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, race, gender, employment, unemployment status. And as we developed like the first 20 or 30, we would look at the composition of our sample, and then at that point we would do targeted solicitations to try to flesh out our sample. The interview included questions covering these areas. So we really asked in-depth questions, open-ended questions. And these are the chapters in the book. And let me explain what I mean by this, why I use these terms: being alive, being able to survive, being with others. I use those terms intentionally because I feel that work is part of our existence. It's part of our sense of being in the world. It's a kind of philosophical sense that in many ways work is part of what roots us in the social and economic world. So I felt like it was really important to kind of capture that in the language that I used. I also felt like, in the terms of this first chapter, that work, when it's going well, is one of the ways in which we feel most alive in the world. We feel most engaged in the world. So there was an intentionality to this particular language. You can see that the chapters do cover some of the same kinds of some of the same needs that I went over in psychology of working theory, but it also elaborated upon them, and I also was able to kind of differentiate them here and look at them in much more depth. So the book was written actually for people in our field, but also was written for a general audience. So hopefully you'll read the book, or if you've read it already, you will notice that it's not written with as much psychological language. In fact, Ron Sultana, who I really respect a great deal, wrote a review of the book for the British Journal of Guidance and Counseling. Maybe, Mark, you read the review. And I remember this phrase that David wears his erudition lightly. So I felt like what he was referring to is that I wrote it for more of a general reader. So I didn't use as much, I didn't use a lot of academic shorthand language. But that was the intention, to try to capture for people to read it outside of our field. which I think is happening to some degree. So what I want to do here is actually give you a little bit of a tour of what the findings were. And I'm going to do this by giving one or two quotes for some of these chapters. And I think these quotes really tell a story that you could see is revealed now in much greater depth and much greater intensity during this pandemic period, where we have had in the US high levels of unemployment. The unemployment rate has gone down somewhat, but we still have, I think, about 30 million people unemployed. And we also have people whose work lives have been turned completely upside down, people who are working, whose jobs have been eliminated and now doing what we call essential jobs. I mentioned you the same term in German, people with the essential workers who had to be out there in the virus, in the worst of times, delivery people, clerks in grocery stores. So under this, the first chapter, well, it's actually the second chapter of the book, being able to survive and thrive. So the core of this chapter is that is the centrality of work in our survival. And again, looking at this from an evolutionary perspective, but also for all intents and purposes, people do need to work to survive in most countries. And if you don't work, you may be eligible for some social support, economic, financial support. But in places like the US, it's going to be a big challenge to be able to get that support, and it will not yield a living wage, a capacity to survive on your own. So here's a person, actually I interviewed this person who was a Black woman, an African-American woman, who was living in a homeless shelter in Boston. And I interviewed her probably in around 2015 or so, 2014 or 2015. And this is what she said. She says, "I'm living with no money and you have no money. In the USA, you need some type of money. And now this is my second year at my local community college. I'm working, I'm striving very hard, keeping my grades up, dealing with the stress. I'm having family issues." I remember what she mentioned was her family was very involved with her and asked her to do a lot for them, even though she could barely take care of herself. She's got a lot of issues going on there that are trying to distract me from focusing on my school. I'm in desperate needs, so now here I am. And that's what she meant by she was in the shelter. This next quote is from the chapter on being with others, which is the chapter about relationships and connection and the intertwining nature of work and relationships. So in this particular quote was really profound for me. I didn't interview this person. One of my students did, but I've read his interview many times. This man was Italian American who was working in the Boston area actually in the 90s and ran a recording studio and had a reasonably good life, and he was doing well. And then he ended up moving to New York, and he actually ended up going to jail as well because of an incident where I think he was drinking and driving and he may have injured somebody. I don't know if he killed somebody. It wasn't clear in the interview, but in this accident, somebody got seriously injured and he had to serve time in jail. So this is what he said: bankruptcy. I felt like a failure in that I wasn't able to change and market myself well or adjust to the changes in the recording industry. There was an emotional and mental impact on me that hit me. And it happened to be at the same time that my ex-wife was having an affair. So the divorce was impending, the bankruptcy was impending, and my decision-making was deteriorating. And that's what led to my car accident and prison eventually. That was probably the darkest time in my life because all my identity, again, for me as a man, my identity is in my work. And my marriage, both those things were falling. My twin towers were falling apart. So that's a metaphor that we use in the US. To feel these two twin towers of his life falling, I thought was such a powerful metaphor that I actually used that at the end of that chapter where I talked about work and relationships as being aspects of ourselves where we put ourselves out into the world. And much like any building, those very tall buildings, they were out there in the world as well, and in many ways vulnerable. You know, we put those buildings up, and like the same way as we put ourselves out into the world of relationships and work, and we don't quite know what the world is going to dish out to us. So I felt like that was a very powerful metaphor, that in many ways work and relationships are aspects of ourselves where we do engage in the world in ways that we can't really control. So the next chapter was on becoming something bigger than ourselves. This whole idea of social contribution, which I think is so important. So this person who I interviewed was a person who was a social worker. And what she said was this: I want what I do to mean something to someone, that it makes their life better. So it's not just a paycheck that I'm looking for when I'm working. I'm looking for a sense that I'm helping people. There's a product that needs to be out there. There's something that needs to be said to someone. There's something that can help someone along the way. Whenever I approach work, it has to benefit someone, and that's where I get my enjoyment from. These feelings of what I'm doing matters. That picks up on this very important idea of having work that matters, which is an important point. I know Mark Zivickas has talked about that as well. And then there's this individual that I think I interviewed this person as well. She was a woman who worked at a call center. She had started college and left, and she was still living with her parents. And she was actually the supervisor in the call center. I don't think I've read an interview or talked to somebody who hated their job quite as much as she did. I remember she made this point that the day before the interview, she had a terrible stomach virus, gastrointestinal virus. I'm sure we've all had them. They're like the worst things you could have. She said she would rather have that than go to work. I think that says, that's like, wow, that's all you need to know. So this is what she said to me: I just don't feel like I'm a productive member of society. You know, like I'm not a doctor saving lives, and I'm not a firefighter putting out fires. You know, I just feel like my job is it just doesn't make a difference in this world. So being able to care, I also devoted a full chapter to this. Caring has been critical, as we know, to our evolution and to our development. It's an important part of our identities. This individual I interviewed was a person who actually had cancer at the time of the interview, and worked initially as a computer programmer, then moved into education to work as a teacher. But he was no longer able to work when he was ill. And he actually ran a support group for the people who had the particular type of blood cancer that he had. And he said this: he said, I think that caregiving is very important. I can't really say that running the support group has saved any lives, but certainly I've saved people a lot of money by researching. What he did was he researched how to get financial support with this particular type of cancer. Because again, in the US, we don't have national health. We don't have access to healthcare. So when you get very sick, even if you do have some health insurance, it may not cover everything. And he found ways for people to access financial support. So he made this point: when I was first diagnosed and realized that this could be an expensive proposition, I was brought right into the local oncologist financial advisor, and she told me a number of ways that patients could get financial assistance. And I took those ways and I told every member of our support group about them. And I know for a fact that I've saved people a lot of money. It is engaging, and I think it's the most important work I've ever done in my life. It was a very moving passage. Work is also a place where, in the US in particular, I know I could only speak about the United States, that again, because work is an aspect of life where you can't control your surroundings, you can't control who you're with, that people are exposed to oppression and harassment, often in ways that they could never have predicted. So here we asked people whether they believe in the American dream. Here, this was an African-American person we interviewed, and he said, I think that if you are white, that's true. I don't believe that it's true if you're a person of color. I don't think that it's true if you're an African-American. I know there are a lot of barriers, there are a lot of stressors, but I know that is not a reality, and that's not a reality for everyone. So the concept of being without work, I wrote a very long chapter in this book on unemployment. In fact, I use this chapter now in my classes because I thought it really captured unemployment well. So this is a person that one of my students interviewed who was unemployed, and they said the following: work is portrayed as a place that is not really helping anyone anymore. It's not doing it. I can't go to a job today and don't know if I'm going to be there tomorrow. I don't have the assurance there. I don't have the way of figuring out whether my check is going to come again or whether I'm going to get an unemployment check. I don't know whether I'm going to have food on my table, or if I'm looking for a next bed in a shelter. You know, it's not guaranteed. It's just where it hurts people the most. So let me go over some of the findings from this book, and I'm going to connect these findings to the current situation we're all in with the pandemic. So first off, one of the takeaways from this book was the deeply felt psychological experience of work that people had. So the level of intensity was really pervasive. Many people were very scared and angry and very anxious. Some people did feel content, some felt hopeful, but there was a subtext. Even at this point, when the economy was getting better in the US, there was a subtext of anxiety. People did not feel secure about work. So actually, what I mentioned here is that look what happens when work disappears. And this is a line to get to a food bank in the US, to get to a place where you can get food. Notice it's a shopping center, it's a shopping mall. The mall is closed, it's during the height of the pandemic. People were waiting here to get food from that truck up here. People got on these lines at 12 in the morning, and the food banks didn't open until 8. So I think if you want to know about the American dream, this is what happened to it. That there was no safety net, really, not enough of a safety net. People didn't have enough savings when the pandemic hit. And unlike the European countries where governments helped to bail out employers so they would continue to pay their workers, in the US, we paid the workers directly, but that has not been consistent. And there was an additional amount given, $600 a week, that is no longer available. So it's a very difficult situation. Another important trend, and this actually became the subtitle of the book, is the idea that we noticed an erosion in the workplace. And what I mean by an erosion is that there were certainly aspects of the workplace that didn't have the safety net, that didn't have the resources, didn't have legal structures that would sustain them. But people also felt this erosion internally. There was a psychological fragmentation related to the anxiety about work. So the erosion was both external as well as internal. And the vulnerability that was evident in this book has become so much more pronounced as the pandemic emerged. Another theme in this book was the question of sustainable livelihoods and working. So the issue here is that in many countries, we have combined the capacity to sustain oneself with work. There is a movement, of course, for basic income guarantees, and that initiative is discussed all around the globe. There are some countries that are trying it, and actually, in some ways, some of the support systems that countries are providing for some of their citizens now models basic income guarantees. But this was an issue that people talked about, that they really felt this issue of the precariousness of their ability to sustain themselves. This was with people who even had what we would call decent jobs, in part because of the trauma of the Great Recession of 2009, 2011. Another complexity that emerged was the issue of assessing causality in the workplace. So people struggled to make sense of the changes in the world, and they didn't really have a clear sense of understanding. They didn't have a critical consciousness about what was taking place in the world of work. And in a very sad way, my students and I noticed more than a few participants engaging in the sort of blaming others that it feels like Donald Trump has given license to. So we saw, people from one particular group blaming people from another group. We saw some women saying, a few women said, I can't deal with working with women. There was this kind of marginalization and othering of people and of groups that was very disconcerting here. Wasn't in the majority of the participants, but it was disconcerting because it wasn't just a few either. So let's talk about some of the implications of the book. In terms of individual implications for people, people experience a sense of unpredictability. They were very much affected by the precariousness of the work context, the lack of stability was very much internalized by people. They just felt the sense that they weren't sure what was going to happen next. And the impact of a weak social safety net was a huge takeaway in this book. And again, this is very much foreshadowing what happened to us during the pandemic. Inequality. Inequality is a big issue in our country, and I think it probably is in Switzerland. I'm not quite sure, but in the US, it's a huge problem. People discussed it. People were aware of it, and people who were struggling were aware that people had a lot of resources here. And even a few people who were doing well felt like they wanted some solution to inequality because they felt like their doing well was, they couldn't really hold on to it, or they couldn't really experience it in a way that felt healthy, knowing that they're doing so well was in some ways related to other people not having enough resources. In terms of community perspectives, one of the implications in this book was that we felt like improved career services were needed in the United States. I know in Switzerland you have a much better network of career services for people. This was one of the first things, by the way, and I remember this in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan, we had a very good job service then. And actually the job service in the US, there used to be a psychologist at each job service office, a master's level or doctoral level psychologist, vocational psychologist, counseling psychologist, to provide, support for the people who weren't trained in career development or mental health. One of the first things he did was to defund the job service and to allow them to be run by their local municipalities, which sounds good in theory, but it really was not. It's not very good because the funding was not stable, and there was no standards, no regulations, and we have a wide disparity in quality of our what we call our one-stop career centers now. And I remember Reagan did this in the early 1980s, and I remember then thinking, this is not a good idea. Improved lifelong learning opportunities are also needed to help people. People were aware that their jobs could end, and they were worried about, how am I going to get trained to go into another field? And people also felt that they needed a social contract in terms of, what does society expect of me in order for me to have a decent, stable job? And that this wasn't clear to many of the people we interviewed. So in terms of implications here, I did argue for humane policies about working. The last chapter went into detailed policy recommendations, including the point that I did argue that our society can create sufficient jobs. I'm still convinced that it can. There's no question that it can. It will require redistribution of resources and prioritizing different sorts of things, such as caregiving work, work in sustaining our environment. There's so many things that need to be done that could be done if the government will get in the business of trying to help create sufficient work. I know our right-wing politicians don't like to hear that. But I think that it's going to have to happen at some point. The ILO's decent work agenda, I argue in the book, should be incorporated in all of our policies about working. It's not a very radical agenda. It's actually a kind of left-center agenda. I wouldn't call it a radical left agenda. But almost every country has signed on to the ILO and to the decent work agenda, but it's an aspiration. And it's not a policy that can be implemented with any kind of structure. In terms of creating decent work, I do think infrastructure work is a short-term solution. People in the US are always talking about it, but I don't see this as a long-term solution. We need longer-term solutions, such as economically sanctioning caregiving work, providing people with opportunities to get paid for caregiving family members and others. Create work, as I mentioned, based on a fair tax policy. And in terms of worrying about robotics, I think we know that there's a lot of jobs that will not be replaced by robots, jobs that involve empathy, teaching, counseling, arts, and creativity. We also need to create a planned approach to connect the public and private sectors in a more systematic way. So I presented this book briefly to my colleagues at Boston College, and one of my colleagues said to me, David, your cover of the book is depressing, your presentation's depressing, where's the hope? And I said, you got a good point. I have to make sure that I talk about the hope, because I did end this book on a hopeful note. We can't make changes unless we understand what's going on. We can't make changes unless we name it, unless we understand the causes of what's happening. By doing that in this book, I think we can create, I do have a hopeful scenario of what can happen. For example, many of the participants from an individual perspective did feel they had some degree of hope. They had resilience. They had exercised a lot of creativity in their lives. There was a great potential of work to help people feel alive and engaged. That still is happening. In this pandemic, we are being forced to critically evaluate institutions. And I think in some ways the pandemic is fast forwarding a process that I argued for at the end of the book, which is we need to critically evaluate how work is going in our society and to look at all the institutions that are involved with work, labor, unions, the free market, government, public policies, and really think about how we could reinvent them. And I think this pandemic is forcing us to really reevaluate the nature of work. So my closing comments are that the people in the book were very passionate and eloquent about work. But the reality of people's work lives was much more brutal and harsh than I expected. The erosion of work was apparent. And as I said, the psychologist part of me is kind of more like a sociologist in some ways in my writing, but the psychologist part of me was powerfully affected by how people's psychological experience of work was so fragmented and full of anxiety and fear, and often included a lot of displacement of anger and of anxiety. So thank you.